talk to me about, as we kind of start to wrap up here, talk to me about sharpening. What do you think about with sharpening in general? There's a lot of people listening who are, line cooks and culinary school students and sous chefs at restaurants, and so they're either used to sharpening their own knives or they're used to dropping them off at someone who sharpens it for them, and maybe they're kind of wanting to get into sharpening. How do you approach sharpening in general, and what do you feel like most people get wrong with sharpening?
Hmm. The cliche answer is find something that works for you, which is, it sounds stupid as fuck, but it's kind of true in my mind.
Right.
Like, I've sharpened knives at farmers markets and for like chefs and stuff like that. And a lot of people, if they pick up a knife from, a chef, they're just like, did you even take care of this? Like, what the fuck? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it looks beat up to hell.
Yep.
But some context, like one of the knives I sharpened for somebody, it was not good. I was like, you probably should consider buying a new knife. Well, that guy, and I'm sure a lot of chefs can, like relate to this. He was working like 16-hour days. He had a family. He's probably working a part-time job, and that restaurant was going fucking 150% all the time. Like, are you going to find time to take care of your knives in that kind of environment where you don't really have that kind of control? I don't know. Like,
Probably
I'm
not.
I'm interested
Yeah.
in hearing I'm
Yeah.
interested in hearing your thought because you have
Sure.
experience in that.
Yeah,
You know?
so the approach that I always took with it was similar to how a lot of people look at car maintenance, where
Mm-hmm.
you may or may not drop the car off to get an oil change just for sake of convenience. But if you break down on the side of the road, you at least want to be able to have a competent, sense of what might be wrong with your vehicle, because, you could save yourself the expense of getting it towed if you just know that you need to, fix something with a spark plug, or something is unplugged and not connected right, or, whatever. And I think the same about knives. I think that if you are the person who doesn't have the time to spend the 2 hours every 2 weeks sharpening your knives, which is typically what it takes when you're working professionally, depending on how many knives you have.
Mm-hmm.
I just see it as like, I tell the story sometimes of this guy that I worked with who would buy a new knife. He would buy a $30 Victorinox, and he would work with it until it got dull, and then he would throw it away and buy a new one because he couldn't be bothered to sharpen his own knives. And I think that what is almost required when you're kind of jumping up to higher quality steels, if you want to get and this is something that you can speak to more than I, but like if you're going to use a nice steel or you're going to use a nice handle, you kind of want the two to complement each other, right? Like you don't want to have really amazing steel with an edge that is specifically designed for the blade profile and how this knife is designed to be used, and then you end up throwing a really cheap kind of like feels really shitty in your handle on it. And you don't want the
Right.
reverse, right? Where you don't want this amazing, uh, uh, inlaid carbon fiber type of setup on the handle, and then the steel is just horrendously bad and it can't hold an edge to save its life, right? So,
Yeah.
but what happens when you jump up to that level is the price goes up, right?
Yep.
So if you're going to make this investment in a knife that is $200 plus for most people is kind of that threshold of like, okay, well I've gone up from the kind of standard run of the mill can get it at a standard cook store knife. I'm really trying to make this investment. In my mind, that you have kind of put your flag in the ground where you're saying when this edge gets dull, which it will, that's just the
Yep.
nature of using these tools, I'm not going to throw this knife away. I
Yep.
am I am choosing that I'm going to do the work required to re-up the edge of this knife. Whether you do it or whether you have someone else do it, it doesn't really matter to me. But I feel like what it gives you is it gives you the ability to understand that, oh, I had a guy who I went to. He was my roommate when we were living in New York. He was working at Momofuku Noodle Bar, and
Yeah.
as an intern, his one of his jobs was to slice the green onions for service. And he had a Misono UX10, and he would constantly come home and tell me like, after like 4 bunches of green onions, and I have to slice 30 bunches a night, I think is what he told me. He was like, after 4 bunches, my knife gets dull, and I don't know what's wrong with it. And, me having some knowledge of like how just blade geometry works, and how like after you're cutting these kind of really harshly layered onions, the edge is going to curl, so you either need to hone, or you need to, like, before your shift starts, you just need to run it over a stone to make sure that the edge is kind of like, there's not any little microchips in it, like there's not any teeth that are going to curl over and cause an unpleasant cutting experience. But to someone who is unfamiliar with knife sharpening in general, they just see it as, oh, there must be a problem with the knife. In the same way that I look at the car analogy, it's like, oh, well, my car won't start. If oh, well, it's because you're repeatedly kind of doing a rock chopping motion through onions, that's going to cause even the sharpest edge after a couple of minutes to kind of like curl over a little bit, and all it takes is a quick hone to get it back into a good place. But kind of like, that's how I think about just sharpening in general. But it's a very principle kind of based approach to it, where having the knowledge of why the knife does what it does is helpful, because then if, all of a sudden, because for chefs, their prep list often changes either from week to week, from day to day, from season to season, like you're using spring onions during the spring, but then all of a sudden maybe you want a different edge on your knife when squash season comes around and you're working with something that's a little bit harder. You know what I mean?
Yeah. My take is,
yeah,
it's like, if you're getting into $200 plus territory, you have a responsibility to do a little bit of homework.
agreed.
Like, it's ultimately what you want, but if you want a nice knife, you have to do a little bit of homework. And even just a tiny little bit helps a lot. It's like, well, find some videos on what sharpening actually is, figure out like the process, and then from there you just kind of practice and then you get better at it. But like, if you buy a nice knife, you can't have the excuses just like, well, I don't want to take care of it and I want a nice knife. It doesn't work like that. You have to, they go hand in hand.
And that's what I wanted to be clear about with people, is that, yes, I put out so much content about just sharpening in general because I do want people to have the agency to take this into their own hands. But it's not a case of me wanting to shame anyone for taking it to someone to sharpen it for you. I just don't want people to be completely clueless around kind of what's happening with their knives, or in a pinch. 'Cause like, it's very real where, I don't know, all of a sudden your chef gives you the opportunity to travel, and you're all of a sudden you're in Miami, and you open your knife bag after the first day of prep and your knife is dull. Are you going to show up for that guest chef dinner where you're helping your chef with a dull knife? I don't think anyone would want to, so are you going to do the work to try to find, say hypothetically you call the knife sharpener in Miami and they say, hey man, we're fully booked. Like, we can't get you your knife back for another week. What are you going to do in that situation? So
Right.
just to have that in your back pocket, like, you don't like, if you're the person who's working 14 hours a day, there's no shame in sending your knives somewhere to get them sharpened, take care of them, because ultimately, like, it's a safer way to cook, but it's a more enjoyable way to cook as well. But yeah, I just like that's kind of how I approach sharpening in general. And I thank you for kind of like putting out content as well to help people wrap their head around this, because it is intimidating when you start.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's how I started with knives. I was just like, well, I should learn how to sharpen. And
Right.
there's just so much bullshit. I was just like, what is sharpening? Like, what the fuck is happening to this edge?
Yep. And so, do you, for someone that's starting, do you recommend that they kind of get like the $30, $20 Victorinox just to see what angles on a whetstone does to a bevel, or how do you approach like teaching a complete newbie?
I don't really know anymore. Like, I've sharpened Victorinoxes. They're pretty soft, and to me, those knives and knives with similar steel, it's hard to kick up a burr and feel it compared to like.
I see.
Compared to, I don't know, even just a $20 upgrade from that, like the Tojiro or something.
Sure. So find a knife. What I'm hearing you say, and what people can hopefully take away from it, is find a knife that has a steel that reacts, that gives you some feedback when you're on the stones.
Yeah, but also if you want to work with what you have, go for it.
Absolutely. But I think there is this fear. I mean, literally somebody sent me a knife 2 weeks ago, and it was like a Wusthof, but they were just completely befuddled by the fact that they were scratching the side of the blade when they would go to sharpen. And to me, that's a simple case of, oh, well, your angle is a little bit too shallow. You know, you need to kind of like lift it up a little bit and, you know, use your fingers to press more into the opposing side of the blade so that you keep your angle consistent. But I think that it is, and this goes back to you and I talking about the balance of a knife. So much of the sharpening process is by feel, you know. I can't give you numbers of like, oh, calibrate your hand to setting number 8, and then all of a sudden apply 13 pressure, and then you'll be fine, you know. Like it's such a feeling kind of thing to it. So it's hard to teach sometimes.
Yeah, and that's why I don't like jigs. Everyone's just like, oh, well, what about the jig? I was like, yeah, it'll work, but like if it doesn't work, how are you gonna know what's going on?
Right,
you don't.
Right. Yeah, that's so funny. I tell the story sometimes of like, I heard all these asymmetrical bevel conversations going on of like 70-30, 70-30, 60-40, blah, 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 80-20. And I misunderstood what people were talking about when they were talking about where the bevel went. And so for about a year in culinary school, when I first learned sharpening, I was doing it backwards. So I was like, I had the bevel on the wrong side. Like I turned all of my knives left-handed over time.
Nice.
And so like through that process, I basically learned like, oh, this is how this affects this. And this is what happens when you have to flip it back the other way. And so like it was, you know, in the moment, it felt like such a failure and I felt like such a dumbass, but like it ultimately taught me how to create bevels on knives over time. So that was like a really valuable learning experience for me.
Sometimes learn the hard way. You like kind of get it better.
100%. Talk to me about your, you know, as we're kind of wrapping up here, your relationship with food just in general.